All right, so welcome to the what I believe is the final meeting for 2016 of the online political science colloquium. My name is Sam Bell. As you might know, so I'm not Emily Ritter. I'm filling in for Emily this week, and going to sort of hopefully try to keep the train on the tracks and for this meeting of the workshop. Sam Bell from Kansas State University. Before we get started, I just want to introduce our panel, our discussants, and our paper presenter. This week's meeting, the paper is being presented by Cathy Wu. She's a doctoral candidate at University of Texas, Austin. She's going to be presenting a paper titled Public Resolve, Endogenous Publicity, and Crisis Bargaining. We have three discussants to sort of provide comments and questions to Cathy after her presentation. I'm just going to sort of list the discussants in the order I see them on the screen. We have Ahmer Tarar from Texas A&M, Leah Windsor from University of Memphis, and William Spaniel from University of Pittsburgh. I hope I didn't butcher anybody's names, but you can correct me when we get started. I think what we'll do is again start with that 15-minute presentation from Cathy, open up for discussion, and then we'll go from there. And so, unless I've missed anything, I will turn it over to Cathy, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So, hi everybody, this is Cathy Wu. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Texas. It's a great pleasure to be able to present here. All right, let me see. Share the screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
All right. So this is one of the major part of my dissertation. So basically the title is Learning Audience Resolve, Endogenous Publicity, and Crisis Bargaining. And it sort of started with this particular puzzle about China-Taiwan relations. And when Mr. Chen, Mr. President of Taiwan from 2000 and 2008, when he actually strongly pushed for the formal independence of Taiwan by actually conducting a referendum, UN referendum in 2007, asking Taiwanese people whether Taiwan should join the United Nations under the name Taiwan. So this was a clear challenge to the Chinese government. However, Chen backed down in the end, and more interestingly, he was forced to back down by his people, as the majority of Taiwanese voters declined to vote in the referendum. So I was puzzled by why people do that. If, as the theory suggests, we should actually anticipate that they value national prestige. So then it's kind of not consistent with what we know from the literature, because most literature studying about increasing public attention treat war as a problem of informational asymmetry. Okay, so everything is okay, right?
We seem to be having some audio issues, but I think that I think we can still hear.
Okay, but you can also hear the slide. You can also see the slides, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry about that.
No,
and so we basically treat war. So scholars basically treat war as the problem of informational asymmetry. And costly signal is basically a solution to increase the credibility of communication, because then a truly tough state must be willing to pay some extra cost than all other not so tough states are willing to pay. So it's the extra cost part that improves the effectiveness of communication and making the communication more informative. Otherwise, states would have some uncertainty about each other's capabilities or resolve, etc. So in the context of crisis diplomacy, and tying hands usually refers to extra cost for being caught bluffing. And so if leaders can show their hands tied, meaning that they are less likely to bluff, so the information they communicate should be more credible. Sorry. And leaders So the existing literature argues that domestically, leaders can make their hands tied by the public. And Theon argues that we should consider security crisis as a public event so people pay attention to it, and they will punish their leader for being caught bluffing because they believe that this is actually damaging national prestige or national reputation. So based on this logic, the more audience cost leaders are subject to, and the more credible their threats are. Therefore, this tying hand mechanism should be more effective when people pay more attention or threats are actually issued by democratic leaders, because arguably people from democracies are more capable of punishing leaders. So that's what we know. And if we follow this logic, it seems a little puzzle that actually in the previous case, the Taiwanese people are sort of untie leaders' hands because sometimes they do prefer peace to war. So my question basically is, if greater public attention somehow unties the leaders' hands in crisis bargaining, in crisis diplomacy, and why do leaders sometimes still engage greater public attention in the first place? So why do Chen actually conducted a UN referendum, which for me is a very high-profile gesture in the first place? And how does it affect crisis diplomacy and the risk of war? So that's basically my question, the question I'm trying to answer in this paper. So what we have known so far is that people do concern about national reputation, and which means that backing down is always not very desirable, and leader would have to pay audience cost for bluffing. But on the other hand, it's also reasonable to assume that sometimes people do prefer peace to war, as we see from the previous case, and therefore leader would have to pay some policy cost for following through his threat if that's not what people want in the first place. So I'm trying to add another dimension to this. I'm trying to add policy cost for leaders to implement unpopular. And what do we determine the public policy preferences? I'm going to assume that a key to determine the public's policy preference is how many the cost the public is willing to bear in the event of war. So the more cost people suffer from war, and the more they will actually prefer backing down to standing firm. So for simplicity, I'm going to just assume a dovish public with a higher cost of war and a hawkish public with a lower cost of war. And similar to the crisis bargaining literature, I'm going to assume the cost of war is unknown to the foreign target. And leader is actually going to choose a level of public attention when making threats. So this is somehow different from the existing literature, which usually assumes that the level of public attention is either constant or exogenously determined by regime types. So I argue that leaders can actually able to manage the level of public attention. For example, by deciding, say, the rank of the speaker, or the occasion or the frequency of speeches or threats, or even go beyond simply oral statements, like what President Chen did during the for the Taiwan UN referendum. So how does public attention affect a leader's political cost? In particular, I'm going to argue that greater public attention actually raises the relative importance of policy substance. For example, if backing down is popular, if backing down is what the public wants, which is contradictory with the concern of future reputation, I'm going to assume that increasing public attention actually makes the current choice between war and peace more important than the concern about future reputation. So I'm going to present a formal model which basically includes the main parameters that I just talked through. So nature decides a hawkish or dovish public, and after observing that, leaders choose whether to make a high-profile threat or a low-profile threat. And the foreign opponent basically have to choose making an offer based on the level of public attention it observes from the leader. And after observing the foreign opponent's offer, then the people will decide whether to choose the fight or not. And finally, based on whatever the public's preferences, leader would decide whether to stand for or back down. So I keep all the parameters independent and just people interested or you can just refer to the paper that you can find. But I'm going to just present you the main results of the model. So apparently, increasing public attention from the model does not always ties the leader's hand. It only ties the leader's hand when the public supports it. However, on the other hand, increasing public attention actually unties the leader's hand when the public opposes it. So in general, the crisis outcome actually depends on, well, essentially depends on whether the foreign target can solve the informational problem by observing the level of attention that the leaders chooses. And the leader's choice of the level of public attention actually depends on the leader's political accountability and sometimes the distribution of power between the challenger and the target. So what do I mean by political accountability? So here I define political accountability as when leaders follows the public opposition against war. So if we say high accountability, basically means that means a situation when the leader always follows public opinion. And moderate accountability indicates the leaders back down only when the hawkish public agrees not to fight. So leader will follow the hawkish public opinion when they are moderately accountable. And low accountability means that leaders will never back down simply because the public opposes war. In other words, the public opposition against war in this case, in low accountability, is never sufficient for the leaders to back down. So if leaders are highly accountable, there exists a situation when we don't really have war. So basically, leader will actually make a separating choices given the type of the conflict it has. But it's actually slightly different from the audience theory, which actually the leader with the dovish public will actually choose high-profile strategies because it's actually easier for the leader to back down in front of these people who are less willing to fight. And because of this separating strategy, so foreign target can easily identify, can easily adjust the information problem and make the appropriate offer given whatever type of the public enemy faces after observing leaders' separating strategy. So we will not have war in this case, and this situation occurs when the foreign target is relatively strong. So that creates incentive for the leaders to avoid the war because it doesn't really want to fight against a strong target, a strong foreign target. However, there exists another situation when the leader with the dovish public stays true, it still chooses a high-profile threat, but leaders with the hawkish public actually tries to hide the true information about its people and actually mimic the dovish public. And because of that, the foreign target still is unable to solve the informational problem. So it can only offer a smaller offer that only the dovish public would accept. And if it happens to face the hawkish public, then we would have war. And basically this situation occurs when the foreign target is relatively weak. And why does this the case? Why does the leader with the hawkish public choose not to reveal the true information? Essentially, it's because if war occurs with the public support, leader will actually gain the political benefits by defeating a relatively easy target and does not have to pay too much cost of war, because in my model, I actually assume that the cost of war is actually imposed on the people. So that creates some incentive for leaders to induce a popular war with public support and against a relatively weak target, so leaders can gain political benefits. That occurs when the foreign target is relatively weak. So to wrap up a little bit, when leaders are highly accountable, increasing public attention actually suggests the dovish public, and there's no war when the target is relatively strong, but then we would have a risk of war emerging when the foreign target is relatively weak. And in the paper, I also discuss about the situation when the leaders are moderately accountable, but this is more similar to the existing literature. Then we will still see that increasing public attention actually suggests the hawkish public, but the risk of war still exists, and this is quite similar to Jessica West's one international organization paper when she talked about China's anti-foreign protest, because essentially it's hard to distinguish the true hawkish public or the dovish public, or in her language, it's basically very difficult to distinguish between authentic protest or manufactured protest. So we still see risk of war occurs. For the time being, maybe I can quickly discuss some empirical analysis I did for this result. Or
yeah, so yeah, you probably want to take about 2-3 more minutes. Is that okay?
Okay, sounds good. So basically, what I test in the main result is trying to test the conditional effects of political accountability. So basically, if we recall from the main findings, if we face a strong foreign target, the risk of war is going to reduce as the political accountability increase. But if we actually face a weak target, there's going to be no significant difference between, there's not going to be significant effects for political accountability on the risk of war. So this is basically what I'm going to test. And I'm going to basically show you quickly all the, so what I'm using is the directed militarized competitive threat. So the dependent variable is threat failure. So 0 is success and 1 is failure. And independent variable, the way I measure accountability is using 2 indicators from the Polity Ivy, which is similar to a recent paper from ISQ talking about audience calls capacity. But essentially, it's a combination between openness of executive recruitment and the competitiveness of participation. So I have some how I code the index in the appendix. If we can discuss later if people are interested. But what I'm going to show you is, so I'm going to just divide a target's relative capability into 2 groups. One group is strong target, and the group is weak target, based on the based on the capability of ratio here. And the main result is basically, okay, if we face strong target, so then we are going to have an inverted U-shaped relationship between accountability and the risk of war. But that relationship basically disappear when we face weak target. So this might be easier for you to see here. So if we see strong target, so basically the risk of war is highest when we have moderately accountability level, and it will decrease once the accountability increases. But that kind of inverted U-shaped relationship disappear when we face weak target, because again, when we face weak target, even the highly accountable leader would have incentive to induce a popular war sometimes with the public support and gain political benefits. And that's the main result from the model. So that's basically confirmed from the militarized comparative MCT data set. So to conclude quickly, basically increasing public attention can untie a leader's hands in democracies. And the signaling advantage of democracies, which we usually talk about, is actually conditioned on the distribution of power between the challenger and the target. And so then we have to so basically I think my model yields some new findings and also integrate some other previous findings and to put it in the same framework, and also calls attention to some endogenous level of public attention, which we don't really pay attention to that. And also the potential divergence of interest between leaders and the public, because sometimes actually public suffer from the cost of war while leaders do not. So with that, I conclude my presentation and really look forward to all the comments from discussant. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Cathy. So now I think we'll sort of open up the floor for questions. And I guess we can start if anyone has any sort of questions or comments kind of related to framing type issues, we can start there. But if there aren't any questions related to that, feel free to sort of jump in on the on questions related to the theory and empirics. And so we're, I guess you can signal when if you want to jump in. Okay, thank you. Ahmer. Oh, Ahmer, your mic is still.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Nice to see all of you. Okay. So I'll just begin my comments by saying that I think that this is very promising because a lot of the recent literature on audience costs, the qualitative critiques, as well as a lot of the experimental work, kind of emphasizes the importance of citizens' policy preferences. So I think Joe Clare in a 2007 JOP article, he was, I think, the first to really point that out, that audience cost theory focuses almost exclusively on the voters or punishing leaders for being inconsistent, but they all have their own policy preferences, and that might mitigate the effects of audience costs or condition the effects of audience costs. And a lot of the experimental work kind of captures or discusses that. So I think it's really useful to incorporate that into a formal model of audience costs, because to my knowledge, no one has incorporated this yet into a formal model of audience costs. And for me, the most kind of interesting result was that under moderate accountability, increasing publicity raises the foreign leader's perception of the citizens' hawkishness. So kind of the usual signaling story that making a public threat is a signal of high resolve. But, you have this interesting finding that under high accountability, making a public threat or increasing publicity actually decreases the foreign leader's perception of the citizens' hawkishness. Okay, so I think this is very promising. And I'm just going to talk about a few of some of the kind of maybe criticisms or questions that I have. Okay, so one issue is that you use a divisible good bargaining model, but you often use language which really is applicable to I guess what you could call discrete choice crisis bargaining models, where, let's say, the defender begins the dispute in possession of the entire good. The target may make a threat to try to, get the defender to concede the entire good to it. So a lot of Ken Schultz's models on audience costs are of those types. So, so you often use the language of, a leader or a citizen preferring war to a peaceful agreement. So I can understand in a discrete crisis bargaining model what you mean by that. I'd rather go to war than live without any of the disputed good. But in a bargaining model, it's not clear what's meant by preferring war to a peaceful agreement. So does that mean such a citizen prefers war even over, the division X equals 1, where the home country gets the entire good? That doesn't make sense. It could make sense that, well, the maximum concession that the other side is willing to make, I prefer war over that. But I think in a bargaining model, using language like preferring war to a peaceful agreement is very kind of ambiguous. Okay, so just kind of related to this, you assume that the leader L pays an audience cost R for what you call backing down, and it pays that cost kind of regardless of what agreement X it gets. So basically, by backing down, you're referring to what in a standard divisible good crisis bargaining model is typically referred to as just accepting the proposal. So you call it backing down, even if it's accepting a very favorable from the other side. And you assume that the leader pays an audience cost, no matter how favorable that deal is. So those are, very non-standard kind of assumptions. So I think you need to kind of maybe in the paper further explain why you call accepting the proposal backing down, no matter how favorable it is, and why the leader pays an audience cost, even if the deal is very, very favorable. So in a couple of articles, Bahar Leventoglu and I, we've looked at audience costs in a divisible good crisis bargaining setting. And so the way we model it is, before the crisis bargaining begins, one or both leaders can publicly declare, this is the minimum share I'm willing to accept. And if it ends up accepting less than that, then it pays an audience cost, but not if it gets more than that. So maybe accepting less than what you publicly committed to getting could be interpreted as backing down. But if you actually accept at least what you claimed you were going to get or publicly committed to getting, it's not clear that that should be interpreted as backing down with an audience cost associated with it. So I'm not saying that the way we modeled audience costs in a divisible good setting is the only appropriate way, but it is a little bit odd to call accepting the deal backing down and assuming there's a cost no matter how favorable the deal. One other issue was, so I'm feel free to let others jump in, or I could.
Well, Cathy, do you want to take a minute to, I guess I want to give you opportunity to sort of respond to those comments, and then maybe continue.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I think these points are very good. So I guess that I think I totally take your point about the first one is the wording that prefer water peace is ambiguous. I think for me, I think for now a better way to do it is kind of highlight the hawkish public and the dovish public. Try to say that just the hawkish public is basically just has a lower cost of war, so it's less easier to be satisfied instead of just saying the prefer water peace, that kind of thing. I agree that's a little bit ambiguous, and at the end of the day, it's still was costly. Like it's hard to say that someone is always prefer war to peace. So I would definitely change that part. And for the second part, I think you're right about, I think your critique is about the way I model reputation, the audience cost is definitely legitimate. So I think I would try the way you suggest, like have like a pre-commitment thing. And the other thing I was thinking is maybe, so this is something I'm still like, haven't not make the final decision to revise this paper, because essentially for this paper, actually the amount of audience cost, the amount of R actually does not have too much effect on the final result. Basically, the final result is more about the policy cost, the political accountability. So either I think I would either do what you suggested, or I was actually thinking about something. Maybe I should not talk too much about audience cost, but the way I try to add audience cost is actually try to kind of speak to the existing literature, like not trying to totally eliminate the cost of reputation. But I think you're right. I should definitely think about how to make it more, to model in a more conventional way. To just about audience cost, even the audience cost is actually not the major part of the story, but just in case that I don't have like weird result just because of the way I model audience cost, the way I model it right now.
All right. Well, thank you, Cathy. So I have not seen other fingers go up, and I've lost my second set of eyes. William. Okay. Oh, and Leah. So we'll go. I'm just going to go in the order of the screen right now. So Leah, if you want to sort of jump in here, and then we'll move on to William.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cathy. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much, Cathy. This is a really fascinating paper, and it really piqued my interest. I've been working on the language of threats and bluffs from a Speech Act perspective, and so this really gave me a really nice framework to think more about that. One of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about with regard to your paper is connecting the accountability types, the low, medium, and high, to regime type. So there's not a whole lot of discussion about what types of regimes would be likely to issue low, medium, or high profile threats. And we know that audience and policy economists are intimately connected to regime type. You mentioned autocrats, and then the operationalization empirics who use polity or rescale polity. So we've done some thinking about it, but I think that some more explicit theorizing or attending to how regime types matter. Communication methods vary widely amongst regimes, whether it's freedom of the press or control of state media, and even the way that authoritarian regimes, like party-based regimes, may be more concerned. Party-based authoritarian regimes may be more concerned about audiences. There may be more attention from audiences and party-based regimes versus, say, personalist leaders. So I guess, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how regime type factors in.
Okay, Cathy, do you want to respond to?
Yes, thank you. So I think that's a great question. I agree that I did not talk too much about in the paper, and I kind of like, but I add a little bit more in another chapter, which I only have like I didn't have too much time to present here. So accountability, I think, is definitely associated with regime types, but on the other hand, I don't want to kind of put just like, and the reason again in the empirical paper I didn't use the polity score because I feel like it's associated, but it's not entirely the same. And the level of political accountability for me is more about to what extent leaders would agree to the public opinion, and like how often, like, do they agree with public opinion all the time, or do they just agree with the more hawkish or nationalistic people? So that's why in the empirical analysis, I try to use some other measures in polity in a policy score, like trying to focus on like how much how the competitiveness level of political tension in the society, and also like how in the competitiveness of executive competition. So I try to use this to, and full disclosure, I actually use the one from the ISQ paper, like by about audience cost capacity, but I do a little bit modification, try to come up with a measure of political accountability. So it's actually, sometimes it's about democracies if political accountability is high based on my measure, but sometimes like we do see something like say Japan before World War II is, even though, so it's actually with moderate accountability, but it's actually a democratic country at that point. But so kind of like a long way to answer your question is basically, I think, so I definitely would add more discussion in the model paper, even though I think I'm going to treat the model paper as a standalone paper without empirical analysis at this point. But I would definitely add more discussion about what I mean by political accountability, and to give more example. I did not have a much clear idea when I wrote this paper before I did the empirical analysis, but I think now I can definitely make to improve that part. Thank you.
All right, and so I think that William, I think you were next in the queue.
Okay, thank you for presenting. I have a couple of questions about the structure of the model and the assumptions that are made. One about the substantive significance and one about how it's actually structured in the model and whether that's the right assumption to make. I'm going to start with the second part. So in the model, the audience makes this decision whether to, I don't know how exactly you want to term it, but they want to fight or they don't want to fight before the leader chooses whether to stand firm or back down. So essentially that means that the audience chooses what sort of audience costs or policy costs that the leader is going to pay afterward. And that seems a little bit different from what the audience cost literature tends to think about, in the sense that the audience gets to pre-commit to the types of costs that they want to force the leader to make. And it seems more natural to do it the other way around, where the leader chooses whether to stand firm or back down, and then consistent with whatever the audience's preferences are, once it's time to actually impose those costs, the audience then chooses which costs to impose. So my first question is on why is it sensible to have the audience make the fight, not fight decision before? What's the substantive justification for that? And then the second question is on the substantive significance of the model overall, where the uncertainty in this paper is on the audience's preferences, where the the audience gets a cost that's low or high drawn originally by nature, and then afterward there's moves. And in the paper, this doesn't come in the presentation as much, but in the paper there's a discussion about how it's more natural to think about uncertainty about the audience rather than the leader. And I'm not so sure that that's immediately clear for a couple of reasons. One, at least in democracies, there's this literature on the democratic peace theory that makes an argument that it's more transparent, or democracies are more transparent in large part because you get public polling data. And there's definitely an argument to be made that public polling data is subject to the same sort of incentives to misrepresent. But then you have to make the argument that, in fact, when I'm asked whether I support intervention in Syria or not, that I am factoring in the fact that my preference in this polling question may be inferred by a foreign government to be a bluff or not bluff, and so forth. And then there's another issue if you think into the Condorcet jury theorem literature, where if we have a large public and there's some sort of pivotal voter in that public, where if everyone is drawn from an uncorrelated distribution, then by the law of large numbers, it's pretty evident where you're going to get that pivotal voter to be drawn from, which means that it's in turn easier to figure out what the ideal point is. And in contrast, when you're thinking about leaders have this active knowledge that they know that there's this incentive to misrepresent. And so while you can have the foreign government start going through spying programs and espionage and all that to try to get intelligence information about the leader, that sort of information seems to me to be more difficult to acquire than the audience.
All right, thank you, William. Cathy, do you want to take a minute to, and you don't have to respond to every comment, but I want to give you an opportunity to respond to all the comments and questions before moving on.
Yeah, sure. These are great questions about the assumptions of the model. So I think in terms of model sequence, I think the way I model it, because I think in this paper I really try to add a dimension about public policy preferences and how that affects leaders' decision. So I think that's why, and I do think if sometimes people, if they are actually more unwilling to fight, and that will actually pose some policy costs on leaders for choosing unpopular policy. And so that's why I kind of want to add that part. And also because the people actually will have to pay the cost for war. And they can actually make some decision during the crisis bargaining, and they actually observe this crisis bargaining the whole process. So I think that's kind of why I put this before the leader's final decision. But I think you're right, and if I put the public's final decision after the crisis bargaining, after leader's decision, that would be more similar to the conventional audience cost theory, which makes I think leaders would somehow be punished for doing something, and say like if leaders will lose election. But I think if as long as leaders would actually pay policy costs as a model here, if he stands firm after public opposes war, I think that would be similar to the conventional model, if I'm correct. But I would definitely try to add that in like to see if there's any like very surprising results that comes out. So that's about the model sequence and the uncertainty. So I thought about that a lot, about like the certainty between leaders and the public. So one thing I do notice that there are definitely more studies about leaders, uncertainty about leaders, whether from the perspective of foreign target or whether from the perspective of the public. So that's what I think, okay, there's already lots of studies about the uncertainty on the leader side. But I do think there's also lots of uncertainty about the public. And one thing here is especially, even though my thought is that even though we can actually outside leaders can actually, or outside audience can get lots of information from public polls, but still it really depends on what the question are asked in the poll. So that actually, so when I look at the public polls in the Taiwan referendum cases, that's basically what my impression. So there are lots of public opinion poll asking Taiwanese people before the referendum, asking them that, what do you think about the idea of a UN referendum? Do you think Taiwan should join the United Nations? So if people get this kind of question, the majority of people will say yes. But there are only one question asking people like, okay, if doing this referendum means that indicates the aggression of China or like some risk of war between China, would you still do that? And then the number goes down significantly. So, but again, I mean, there's one question, but we don't really have those many questions that really talking about the risk of war. I mean, in that particular case. So I think my point is we can still get some knowledge about the people, but from the perspective of foreign government, I think their knowledge about the people is always much less compared to the domestic leaders. So I think the assumption here is really about, compared to the leader, the foreign target knows much less about the public. So that's kind of the reason I make this assumption. But I definitely agree that there's lots of uncertainty about the leader, and that's why I think for the low accountability scenario, that's just about the public. But then there's what still occurs under the low accountability scenario, which is not accounted in my model, because in my model, actually, there's no war in the low accountability scenario because the public opinion does not really matter. But then we do see like autocracies do fight a lot of war, and that then my explanation to that is basically, well, that's because we still have lots of uncertainty about the leaders' preference or leaders' private information, and that's not accounted in this model, because in this model I kind of just want to focus more on the uncertainty of the public opinion.
All right, I think William, you have a follow-up, correct?
Yeah, it's more of a follow-up, it's not a question, it's more of a comment. My concern, to be clear about what I'm pitching to you, is not that we should dispatch of uncertainty about the audience altogether. It's that if that's where you want to go with this model, and clearly that's where you do want to go with the model because you can get interesting results out of it, then it needs to be better substantively pitched in the paper on why this is a legitimate sort of source of uncertainty to look at. And you do have a little bit of discussion about it, but it needs to be a lot deeper than where it is currently. So if you can bring out some of the things that you've said and structure it into the paper and get that pitched together, that would go a long way in making the assumptions of the model palatable to a reader and not turning off a reviewer immediately thinking, oh, this doesn't matter, I'm going to reject this
All right, thank you. So unless if I've missed any sort of attempts to get into the queue, I know that Ahmer, you had when you were first talking, it sounded like you had some more comments, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just wanted to also make sure to get back to you since I sort of rudely cut you off, I think.
Me?
I think I rudely cut you off earlier, so I wanted to make sure to give you an opportunity to get back in and with any other comments that you had.
Okay. So this is just related to the previous question, but so when I was reading the model, I also thought, this is, certainly a non-standard, kind of an odd move, kind of having the audience after the foreign leader makes his proposal. The domestic audience can either take an action that you call fight or not fight. And then the domestic leader, L, actually decides whether to accept the proposal, what you call backing down, or whether to stand firm, i.e. go to war. So initially, and this is primarily when I was reading the discussion surrounding figure 1, which you call the baseline model, it wasn't clear that, so you talk about, so then F will offer the bigger of the two reservation values, that of the domestic audience A and the domestic leader L. And it wasn't clear to me at all why F would really ever propose A's reservation value, because A can't actually choose whether to fight or not, to actually go to war, could choose this action that you call fight. And so I was like, initially I was thinking, it just doesn't seem right that the F would ever propose, P minus CA, in other words, the domestic audience's reservation value for war. So then I started, just solving the model, just a complete information version of figure 1 for myself. And it turns out that that's correct. So, it ends up that A kind of has this neat thing where if it chooses fight, it raises L's reservation value, versus if it chooses not fight, L's reservation value is kind of what it normally would be at. And so that's actually how F might actually care about A's reservation value for war, because they might not want A to choose fight and thereby raising L's reservation value. So, it's a non-standard move, but it does get this kind of to this interesting result that the foreign leader, under certain circumstances, actually proposes the domestic audience's utility for war, which is hard to see in any other circumstance how it would, so you could argue that this is a modeling technique or modeling mechanism to kind of just introduce that. I guess in some circumstances, it's plausible to imagine that a foreign leader, kind of recognizes to avoid war. Maybe what I primarily need to kind of offer or propose is kind of the domestic audience's reservation value for war as opposed to the leaders. Although then that gets to the question, it's not the domestic audience that ultimately makes that decision. But the way you've modeled it, it can actually matter. But that's just some thoughts about how you might want to address the question or issue that William raises. So I had another question. So it seems that you're assuming that for a dovish citizen, in other words, whose cost of war is high, high publicity causes it to put greater focus on its policy preferences rather than audience costs, whereas that's not the case for hawkish citizens. So I think that needs a lot more justification. because, you know, the usual audience cost story is that if there's high publicity, then, you know, kind of audience costs are triggered, so to speak, that, you know, now if the leader backs down from a public commitment, then presumably audience costs are going to be significant. Whereas if it's low publicity, you know, no one even knows that a threat or a commitment was made, so why punish the leader for backing down? So I can kind of understand or find plausible the idea that, you know, when publicity is high, kind of people think seriously about what my policy preferences are on this issue, but it's not clear why that would be different for dovish versus hawkish citizens. So I think that, you know, you provide some justification on page 10, but, you know, I think you need a lot more justification for that because, you know, you're essentially saying that for dovish citizens, let's assume the complete opposite of the usual audience cost story, but not for hawkish citizens. So I think that would be kind of a hurdle for, say, getting this paper published. That's something you need to really think about, kind of, you know, and I don't know how crucial that is for your results, but certainly it's an assumption that would kind of raise eyebrows in the review process. It's something you need to think about how to justify.
Yes, Cathy, do you want to respond?
Yes, so thank you. I'm going to start with the second question. I think and that's actually the major assumption, but I think maybe there's some wording issue I need to adjust the confusion. So it's not the difference is not about hawkish and dovish public, it's that once the public chooses not to fight, and increasing public attention will raise the importance of, will basically increase the amount of policy cost and decrease the amount of audience cost. So even though the hawkish public, so it's not about, so the difference is not about the dovish public. That case does not only apply to the dovish public, it's just once the people chooses not to fight, if they are happy with whatever offer from the foreign target. And if that's the case, increasing public attention would basically would make leaders more likely to back down, and because leader will not worry too much about audience costs or about loss of national reputation and pay more attention to just the public's policy preferences. Would that sound better or like more legitimate compared to the division of hawkish and dovish public?
Well, then that puts a lot of burden on the way you model it, kind of the domestic audience choosing whether to fight or not. So I kind of previously suggested that, you know, you can kind of justify that as a, you know, useful modeling technique to getting the foreign leader to care about the domestic audience's preference or their reservation value for war. But I think your response to my other question is now making that choice significant. And then that kind of gets back to William's kind of question. I mean, it's not quite clear. I mean, you're giving the audience a choice, but what does that choice actually mean? Like, how could they actually implement that choice in a way that the domestic leader could observe and then decide? So kind of, you know, it's kind of like instead of A having a choice, maybe, you know, it's just F makes this proposal, then L either accepts or rejects, and the domestic public's preferences affect L's payoffs for accepting and rejecting. So, you know, if they're dovish, then that decreases the utility for rejecting. So kind of the public's preferences might matter, but what is this choice that you're giving them to fight or not fight? I guess then that raises, then what do you really mean by giving them that choice? So just some things you need to think about, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes lots of sense. I would definitely try the way you suggest and see what so basically is not explicitly modeling the public's choice between fight and not fight, because it would be a little bit hard to observe for the leaders in reality, but just like kind of factor into like leaders' preferences given the type of public the leaders has, right? Thanks.
Yeah, so you assume that, the leader knows the audience's preferences. It's only the foreign leader who doesn't know that. And so therefore it knows that, if my domestic audience is hawkish, here are going to be my payoffs for accepting an agreement versus going to war. And here are my payoffs, what they're going to be if they're dovish. So it still affects the leader's behavior, but not through some action that the domestic audience takes. Because then the question is, is that, what is that action? How did they hawkish? What does it mean to choose not fight? And if you're dovish, what does it mean to choose fight? Just some things to think about.
Okay, so I think we have time for a few more questions before wrapping up. I haven't seen. I don't know if I'm probably not being good about paying attention to noticing efforts to get into the queue. But if there are, I think there's probably time for a few more questions if anyone wants to add anything. Yes, Leah.
I was just going to make one other point about reference to McManus's work. She's got a new article coming out in International Interactions, not already out, that I think would really inform some of this as well, on the discussion of tone and rhetoric of drone escalation. Just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay, thank you. So are there any other, again, I might have missed this, but anybody else have any comments or questions? Yeah, William.
Yeah, one other thing that you might want to think about is discussing what happens when lambda can vary into different values than other than just 0 and 1, or if it's treated as generic as 0 or lambda, if you want to have it a binary choice where lambda is some positive value, and see how that changes results and whether certain outcomes are necessitated by the 0-1 structure of the model.
Okay, Cathy, did you want to respond? And again, no requirement to respond. I just want to give you an opportunity to.
Yeah, I would definitely try William's suggestion about like put a lambda more continuous. I suspect it would be okay, but I'll definitely try that. But I don't really get Leah's comments clearly. Maybe it's like a little noise or something. Do you mind repeating it again?
Sorry, is that sorry, whose comment?
Leah's.
Oh, Leah. Okay, yes.
Sorry, one more time?
Yes.
I think that Cathy couldn't hear your initial comment, and so.
So McManus has a new paper coming out in International Interactions that I think would really inform the discussion of threat escalation and tone and rhetoric. And on that point, I really liked the situation about how more extreme threats might actually signal weakness. And this is something that I found in looking at out of North Korea, that the more extreme the threat, the more bluff, whereas the more done it is, more credible the threat is.
Oops. And so I think we're getting cut off a little bit again, but so it sounded like you were sort of suggesting a specific paper. It might be easier, like after, to sort of email that paper, email the name of the paper along. Okay. I'm muted. So now I'm back. So we're at about 11 o'clock. And so if there aren't any other sort of comments and questions, and of course the conversation doesn't need to stop here. If you have additional sort of thoughts you wanted to send along, or if Cathy, I'm sure if you had sort of additional sort of clarifications, I'm sure, I imagine that the discussants would be happy to continue the conversation afterwards. But if there aren't any other sort of questions or comments right now, I think we can wrap things up. And I just want to, again, sort of take the opportunity to thank Cathy for presenting this interesting work. The paper can be found in sort of, I can, if someone, Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the paper can be found up on the online Peace Science Colloquium webpage. And so I encourage folks to sort of go on there and take a look. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the discussants for sort of reading the paper and providing their helpful comments to Cathy. And I also want to give Cathy an opportunity to sort of say any last words, any last words before we get off as well.
Yeah, just thank you so much for all these comments. I think all these are very good and about the assumptions and the sequence of the model and like how I can improve in terms of discussing more like substantive implications of the model. All these are well taken, and that would definitely help me to improve the next version of my paper. So thank you so much for your comments and also for this opportunity for me to present at the online colloquium. Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for sort of bearing with my clumsiness in chairing this session. And one final note that I should probably draw attention to before we get off is that I believe I'm correct. This is an accurate statement. This is the final meeting for the 2016, but the call for papers I think is sort of recently sent out for next year's for the sessions that will be held in the spring semester. So for anybody that's watching, anybody that's sort of here participating right now, if you can encourage folks to sort of submit proposals, that would be great. And so with that, I'll say everybody have a sort of good luck with the end of your semesters and wrapping things up. And thanks again to everybody for taking part. It's been a lot of fun.